and that's where Daniel chapter 1 picks up the story. And I'm going to pick up with verse 1. Let's read together. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, in 601, where Jehoiakim's going to have a change of heart about serving Babylon, and they're going to come back, and he's going to be taken away in 601, and Jerusalem will be destroyed. But that between that and 598. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles for the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed and quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. How many of us here would fit that description? I'm the only one? The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years. He was to teach them, into verse 4, he was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. And I would bet most of us are more familiar with the changes of names rather than the original names in 3 of these 4. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. How many of you would be down with that program? Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. I want us to put ourselves in the position of those 4 young men for a minute. Take yourself back. Imagine you're probably 15 years old. A new power takes over your nation, and he comes in, and you find yourself ripped away from your family. You are basically kidnapped and dragged away hundreds of miles away, and you find yourself in an entirely different nation whose customs are entirely different from yours. The language is different, the religion is different, the food is different. Some of us who have traveled back to the south of the United States might identify with that. A place where everything just throws you off, out of balance, emotionally, psychologically, and mentally. And Daniel and his compatriots find themselves in the face of a culture that clashed with everything they knew, everything they believed, everything that they were. How do you respond in that situation? I love the statement, because there they find themselves with that. And what's the statement about Daniel's response? Daniel resolved not to defile himself. There was a decision made. We're going to look at that, but we're going to take some time to look at the issue of culture. The culture is all we believe, and there's 3 things I want us to grab out of this today as we look at this, because every one of us find ourselves, if we are believers in Jesus and trying to live for the values God has given us, we find ourselves at the crossroads. And instead of yielding and instead of coming together, we find ourselves running the stop signs and having collisions. What's the best response when we find ourselves at that place? Well, three things I want us to grab hold of about culture. I want us to understand first that culture always shifts. Culture is always changing. Those of you who are older understand that, right? We have a video I want you to watch. This guy kind of lays on, but he's not old enough to understand, but he kind of puts it in perspective. If you want to roll that video.
What up, y'all? It's your boy KEVONSTAGE, and my kids are out of school for the summer, and I had to pay money to put them in summer camp, which is fine, but it just reminded me that my kids have a totally different childhood than I ever did. Summer camp, you know what I got for summer? Stay at home, raise myself in the first grade. Don't answer the door, don't use the stove, don't use the microwave, don't use the phone, I'll be home tonight. So I decided to compile all the things that I could think of that are different between kids nowadays and kids when we were growing up. Like hanging up the phone on someone. They will never know the joy of getting mad and hanging up the phone and hearing that sound. You don't get the same effect pressing in or sliding. It's just not the same. They don't know about getting notes that were craftily folded in origami that said for your eyes only, that had a little lever that pulled. It was basically like a paper version of Transformers. They don't know about passing notes during class. They have cell phones. They don't know about the yes, no, maybe on the note, the original curve. Do you like me? Yes, no, maybe. They have cell phones. They don't know about playing hide and seek outside in full neighborhood games of manhunt. They don't know about games like hide and go get it, which is, I'm glad they don't know about games like that. If you do, you were a terrible, nasty child like me. Remember when we were kids before cell phones, you know how you had to find your friends? You had to ride your bike around and find where all the bikes were parked. That was the original send me your location. We played video games. My kids watch YouTube videos of people playing video games, and they have video games. I remember when the arcade video games were better than anything you could have at home. Now, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, that stuff is legit. There's no reason to have arcades. Luckily for kids nowadays, bullying is not nearly as accepted as it was when I was a kid. I got beat up every day. And when I was a kid, it was like bullies made you stronger. You got to stand up for yourself. Now there's a zero tolerance. Where was the zero tolerance when I was getting punched in the face? This is just a personal qualm. Like, why didn't y'all help me? Fat Tony beat me up daily. Kids nowadays don't know what it's like to call somebody on three-way and be quiet while your homegirl or homeboy finds out the dirt. And then you could be like, bah! So you said what? Yeah, you called me on three-way. When three-way was popping, you had to be like, no, before I tell you, I need you to click over and click back so I make sure nobody's on three-way. Now they just have screenshots in Snapchat, and it's all video footage and surveillance, and where's the fun in that? I remember having to have change in my pocket to put into a payphone to call my mom to pick me up. A payphone. Have you seen a payphone in a while? I knew where all the payphones were, and I kept 25 cents, 35 cents, eventually 50 cents to make the phone call. Now the kids just text, Mom, Dad, pick me up. Here's my location. Uber me. Uber me. Yeah, I'm salty, I'm old, and getting crabby. Kids nowadays don't know when the whole internet was AOL, and we had little discs of free trials, and as soon as you got on the internet and waited 45 minutes over, as soon as you finally got on there to go in the chat room, your mom would pick up the phone and the whole internet would go off. Wi-Fi? You got Wi-Fi? Our internet was plugged into the phone in the wall, and you couldn't do two things at the same time. These kids don't know about duck hunt. When you put the gun on the TV and that little dog, when you miss, would hold the ducks and laugh at your soul. I don't know if this is really common, but when I was a kid, the teachers could paddle you. I got paddled at school. I got paddled at home. Matter of fact, anybody that knew my mom could whoop me. The neighbors in the neighborhood could whoop me, people at church, and then I would get another whooping for having to get whooped by somebody other than my mom. I don't even know my neighbors. Kids nowadays don't know the joy of walking around Blockbuster on a Friday night and trying to get a new release and having to return it and rewind it. Everything they want is at the touch of a button. They don't know about watching Ninja Turtles at 3:30. If you get home at 3:59, Ninja Turtles was off until the next day. They don't know about Saturday morning cartoons, waking up with a big bowl of cereal and watching all the great cartoons. They just go, oh, Dad, Netflix is down. No, Netflix. That taught us timeliness and how to get up and be there for something because it wasn't going to come on again. Yeah, I'm crabby, I said it. You don't know what it's like to just take a picture and not know if it's good or not, so you take another one and then you go to Walgreens and get it printed out and be surprised if they all came out good or bad. They can take a picture right now and look at it and delete it and filter it. When I was a kid, if you look black in the picture, you just look black. Wasn't no filter. You got black in the summer. But hey, man, I'm sure when my kids get older in 20 years, they're going to have a whole bunch of stuff that they can complain about. And life goes on. It's your boy, KEVONSTAGE. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, follow me on social media. And if you want me to come to your church and do stand-up comedy, hit up my website. You can also buy shirts there.
Anybody identify with any of that? Culture constantly changes. Just very briefly, let me just hit some things that maybe you can identify with. The telephone has changed, right? Anybody recognize that first one? Yeah, over here. Fashions have changed. Some of you have closets that look exactly like that. You know, you've held on because your shirt's going to come back into fashion, right? How about music? Culture is constantly shifting. And there are times in our lives when these minor shifts happen and we get ticked. And we wonder what's going to happen to the next generation when they start swiveling their hips with Elvis Presley. But you know, those are minor things, right? But our culture is changing in a way that runs counter to everything we know, everything we believe. I want to share a quote with you from a guy who wrote this article for American Dream, and he says the United States is becoming a place where anything goes. And most Americans are okay with that. No matter which side of the culture war you're on, you have to admit our culture is being fundamentally transformed. In fact, new numbers from Gallup confirm that there's been a colossal shift in America's moral values since 2001. Over the past 13 years, we have become a dramatically different country. Many of the things that used to be considered evil are now considered good. And those that were considered good, many of those things are considered evil. In other words, our culture is literally becoming turned upside down, and the values that our national leaders speak about today are far different from the values that our grandparents grew up with. I don't think I'm alone in looking at the culture shift in our nation and being overwhelmingly concerned. Think about the value of life that has happened in our lifetime and how it has declined. Think about the change in the definition of marriage and family. Think about the promotion of abortion. Think about the issues of transgender. Who would ever thought we would deal with that? Think about all of those things, and we find ourselves as believers looking and trying to figure out how do we cope with that. And that's the issue. And that quote, it's up here. If you want it, I can let you have it. But number one thing I want you to note, and it's not new, culture always changes. Nick Solovsky, who preached this sermon for us in Santa Rosa, he said, one of the best things you young people could do is to sit down with an older person and talk to them about how culture has changed in their lifetime. You see Milton right here? He could tell you a whole lot about how this world has changed since he was born 97 years ago. For those of you, that's a long time. But how valuable would it be for you? I mean, because we tend to think things are always been the same as they are in our lifetime, right? Just like that guy was talking about. An older person can help you have perspective and see that what's true today won't be true tomorrow. It will change. Second truth I want us to grab hold of is that culture always seeks conformity. Yeah, have you noticed that? That culture doesn't seem, we live in a society where the talking heads on the TV constantly say, we need tolerance. We need tolerance. We need to tolerate one another. But those of you who have a different opinion from them, it's quick to recognize that the only tolerance they have are for those who agree with them. And culture always pushes for conformity. Difference, being different, is never tolerated. Look, And we think about that, and as I look at this text, there's several things that demonstrate the pressure society puts on us. Romans 12, Paul says, do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world. That Paul understood. Our world is constantly trying to make us like them. It seeks conformity. 3 ways that culture accomplishes it. Number 1, it focuses on the youngest members of society. Did you notice in the text when Nebuchadnezzar asked for some men to be brought in, who did he pick? Young men. Why? He understood something, the same thing that our world understands. You want to change a culture? You begin with the young people. You begin training them and equipping them to become what you want them to be. Nebuchadnezzar's goal was to make them Babylonians. Teach them the language and the literature. In other words, teach them to think like Babylonians. Somebody talked to me about foreign languages, and they said, I heard a person say, I'm so fluent in my second language that I think in that language now. That's when you know you've mastered a language. That is the goal, to teach our children to think like them, to be like them. And I don't want to disparage our education system, but it's happening. It's happening. The government is talking about child care from birth through high school, preschool, and taking over. There's one reason. You look at school districts around the country, and they are banning any ideas and philosophies that conflict with what they believe. You cannot teach creation opposed to evolution. There's a school district in Portland that said, we will not listen to any idea other than the idea of global warming. Why? Because they know one thing. If I get the mind of the youth, I have the culture. So they begin with the youngest. They begin with the youngest. It's interesting. I don't know if anybody heard this or not, but Washington State found this in an article. Newly released health and physical education standards for the state of Washington include the core idea that declares kindergarten children should understand there are many ways to express gender. From the very earliest ages, they are going to talk about gender identity and not letting anybody dictate what your gender is. You doubt that our culture is trying to pressure us to become like them? Get the youngest. Teach the youngest. Train the youngest. But secondly, they seek to remove God. That's what's at the heart of those name changes. You look at the name changes. Daniel, God will judge me. Belshazzar, lady protect the king. And it's a reference to Babylonian goddess Sarpanatu, the wife of Marduk, who is the chief god. Hananiah, Yahweh has been gracious. Shadrach, I am fearful of the God, and it is focused on a Babylonian god. Mishael, who is what God is. Meshach, I am of little account. Again, it has ties to a Babylonian god. Azariah, Yahweh has helped. And Abednego means servant of Nebo, another Babylonian god. Matthew Henry put it very clearly. He said there was one reason for them changing the names, and that was to remove the memory of God from these Hebrew men. We're doing it entirely differently today. Is there any doubt? Is there anybody have any question about we're trying to remove God from our culture? It started way back when they said we can't have the Ten Commandments on city ground or in courthouses. It has continued today. Think about the disagreement and the discussion going on about the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, in school, you can't say that because one nation under God doesn't fit the image, and we try to eliminate it. The prayer and Bibles have been eliminated from our culture and society and public places. We are in the midst of an effort where people are trying to remove God from the public memory. So remove God and you change a culture. Then finally, ultimately, if you can't get it any other way, you begin persecuting. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, you read the story, you'll find out. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bend the knee to the God, and Nebuchadnezzar threw them into a fiery furnace. Daniel refused to not pray, and he finds himself in the den of a lion. And it has continued through the centuries. Today we have regimes around the country who imprison and torture and put people into forced labor who bear the name of Jesus, who will not conform. We have a Middle East going on right now where anyone who refuses to bow the knee to Allah has their life put at stake. I saw this week they burned an entire family to death. Africa, and it goes on around the world. You won't conform, we will kill you. Well, America, we have it great, right? It's happening here. What happened to the bakery in Gresham who refused to bake a cake for a lesbian couple? $135,000 fine because they stood up for their convictions, because they refused to bend the knee. And it goes on and on and on. We get labeled with names like phobics. We get labeled by haters. We get labeled by all those terms that are pejorative, that the community and political correctness exerts pressure on us. Make no mistake, folks, it may not be physical persecution, but it is persecution nonetheless. So that's the second thing I want us to see, is culture always seeks conformity. It will not tolerate differences. And then culture's pressure produces a response. Anytime you apply pressure, you get a response, right? Take a balloon, inflated balloon, and apply pressure. Apply enough pressure, you get a response, right? Take a can of soda, you shake it up long enough, you get a response, don't you? The same is true in culture. When you apply pressure, you get a response. Either you have conformity, and you look at the headlines today and religious news, and there are many churches and denominations who are yielding to the pressure and becoming what the world wants them to be. Whether it's in recognizing same-sex marriage or removing crosses from their building because they don't want to offend the Muslims in their community, or you get pushback. In the 1980s, I believe it's 1980s, we had the moral majority, led by Jerry Falwell, who politically responded and built this movement to exert pressure on American government to maintain the standards and values. Today, we see a response. We find the ugliness of people like the Westview Baptist Church who come out and hold up ugly signs and make slurs against soldiers and against abortion doctors and all these other things that give Christians a bad name, but it's a response against the pressure. Anytime you put pressure, it produces response. Are you feeling the pressure as a believer in Jesus? Are you faced with how do I deal with this system? Sometimes we want to get angry. Sometimes we want to push back. But what's the most positive response? Daniel said he resolved not to defile himself. Before he ever found him in that position, he said, I'm going to serve God. I'm going to stand true. Here, I want to give you a couple things that we find here. Number one, Daniel resolved because he knew who he was and what he believed. As believers, if we don't know who we are, if we don't know our identity in Jesus, if we don't understand what God teaches in His Word, we will never be able to have a positive response to our culture. And it has to be an understanding that comes from this Word. The unchanging, inspired Word of God, who tells me who God is, who tells me who I am, who tells me how I ought to live a pleasing and holy life before Him, and tells me about my world. We need to begin getting into the Word, and as Psalmist says, hide it in my heart, that I might not sin against God. Well, I can't memorize. How many of you know any lyrics to any songs? Song starts up on the radio, and the first thing you find yourself doing is singing. Me, I make up the lyrics as I go. Or repeat them. I remember the words, I sing the words I remember. We can, if it's important, store this Word in our hearts. But more importantly, not more importantly, but along with that, begin teaching our children. One of the things that I see most disheartening is that too many people are surrendering their children and letting the children educate and implement their values through the public schools. Did you hear Michelle Obama's statement? She's talking about the fact that we have to win this election so that we can teach our children proper values. Folks, that is your responsibility as a parent. Deuteronomy 6, God says, I want you to learn these laws, but I want you to take it a step further. I want you to teach them to your children. I want you to talk to your children about them at every moment of the day and help them understand what God wants and who they are in God's sight. If we're going to respond properly, it has to begin here, in our own lives and in the lives of our families. But then, second of all, engage the culture in civil conversations. Do you notice Daniel's example? The guy came and said, here's your meat and here's your wine. And Daniel didn't throw a hissy. He didn't stamp his feet and say, I refuse, I'm not going to eat it no matter what you do to me. What did Daniel do? He said, how about if we do a test? How about if we engage in a conversation? How about if we begin talking on a civil level? One of our speakers at the North American Christian Convention said our input into our culture must begin with civil conversations. There's way too much shouting going on. There's too much disrespect going on. We need to engage each other and exchange ideas and thoughts and discuss. As believers, we need to lead the way in that because the world is strident. If we can calm the conversation and engage. 1 Peter put it like this. He said, always be ready to give an answer for the hope that is in you. And then in verse 16, he added on, do this with humility and respect. There's our key. If we're going to discuss our issues with our culture and with others who that are debating it, be sure we do it with humility and respect. And finally, we need to have that determination that no matter what the world does, we are going to refuse to compromise our convictions. Notice Daniel, he resolved not to defile himself. Did he care what the cost was? Daniel, obviously Daniel, by his example, would have stood up and said, you know, this is where I'm standing, this is my conviction, this is what I believe, and you can do whatever you want to me, but I'm not going to change. Are we in that position? I think we have been so soft in America. We have had it so easy to be believers that we've never had to have that. But those days, I think we're all aware, are changing. Are we willing to stand on our ground? Think about the way people, whether you agree or not, think about the way Muslim people are standing in regard to their convictions. Women wearing the hijab are standing on their convictions and their beliefs, refusing to resolve not to conform. Right or wrong, whether we like it or not, there are people we look at and we know they are people of conviction. Are we people of conviction? Have we established ourselves so powerfully in our faith that we will not be moved? I want to share 1 Peter chapter 4 with you, verses 13 through 14 and verse 16, because he's talking about that. He says, well, verse 12 says, don't be surprised at the painful trial you're suffering as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice that you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when His glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. And verse 16, however, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. Peter's response, it's tough. It's hard in our world. Don't be surprised by it, but be prepared to stand. I want to close with Romans 12:2 again. It says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Notice the last part, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. When we stand at the crossroads of culture, when we find ourselves running into a culture that conflicts with everything we are and everything we believe, we must be ready to respond. We must stand and be the people of God, the salt and light in our world, and become a force of culture shift in our nation today. Father God, we just thank you for your life. We thank you for what you've called us to be, the Spirit that has made it possible, your word that cements it in our hearts and our minds. Lord, today we come knowing that Jesus came into the world and lived his life different. He refused to be conformed. And because of his refusal to conform and his civil and respectful demonstration of and proclamation of the truth, he changed the world. Lord, our nation needs us to stand up and be the people of God, to stand our ground and proclaim the truth. Lord, today we're going to take some time to gather at your table. We're going to come at your invitation, and we're going to remember the body that was broken on the cross for us. We're going to remember the blood that was shed on our behalf. And Lord, as we reflect on those things and reflect on the things that the culture is doing to try and push us back out of view and out of sight, we come celebrating the fact that you have given us your name. Help us, Father, to reflect on Jesus and his commitment to us through these emblems now. In Jesus' name, amen.
In the morning when I rise, in the morning when I rise, in the morning when I rise, give me Jesus. Oh, give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. Oh, you can have all this world. Just give